Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hey, and welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and together we are studying through the New Testament in a year. We are currently in the book of Mark, and today we will be studying Mark 14. We have seen before how Mark will sometimes start a story, move on to a different story, and then come back to the first. When he does this, he wants us to read each story in light of the other. And Mark 14 begins with another example of this. The chapter starts with the religious leaders scheming to kill Jesus. Here's their problem, though. It's Passover week in Jerusalem, which means that Jews from all over the Roman Empire would have been there. It was packed, and a crowd generally liked Jesus. The leaders can't arrest Jesus without being seen or causing a disturbance. So when Judas comes along a few verses later and offers them an opportunity to arrest Jesus by stealth, they jump on it and promise to pay Judas. Between their plotting and Judas's offer is the story of the woman anointing Jesus with very expensive perfumes. She could have gotten about a year's worth of wages if she had just sold it, but she offers it to Jesus. She is the opposite of these men who want to destroy Jesus. She demonstrates true devotion to Jesus by taking the most precious thing to her and using it in service of him. If we want to know what being a true disciple of Jesus is, we can look to this woman. After this, Jesus shares his last meal with his disciples. Again, it's Passover week in Jerusalem, a time to commemorate God's deliverance of Israel from slavery in Egypt and to remember the 10th plague when God promised to pass over the homes of the Israelites who had blood of a lamb painted on their doorposts. Part of commemorating this event includes sharing a meal together. This is the meal that Jesus and his disciples were sharing. What's interesting is how Jesus takes a meal which is about Israel's exodus from Egypt, and he makes it about himself. The bread, for example, which spoke to Israel's hasty departure from Egypt, according to Jesus, is his body. And the wine is the blood of the covenant, language taken from Exodus 24, when God entered a covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. Jesus' point is that his death will bring about a new exodus and a new covenant. Like the Israelites, if we take shelter under his blood, God's wrath will pass over us. This is the new covenant spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, in which God would forgive the sins of his people and put a new law within them. Jesus and his disciples head to the Mount of Olives, where Jesus makes two predictions, that he will rise from the dead and that they will abandon him. You have to love Peter, who says what we probably would say too. I will die before I leave you, Jesus. And yet, Jesus doubles down and assures them that that's not going to happen. Next, Mark takes us to the Garden of Gethsemane, where we find Jesus in agony. This is a moment that reminds us of Jesus' humanity, that he knows what it's like to suffer, and he can empathize with us in our suffering. But despite his anguish, he commits himself to the Father's will by saying, "Not what I will, but what you will." As Jesus is arrested, the disciples scatter just as predicted. If you're confused about the man who runs away naked, join the club. It's not clear why this detail was included. Some think that Mark writes about himself, and it's a way for him to say, I was there and I also abandoned him. But some think it could just be a fulfillment of Amos 2:16, which speaks of brave men fleeing naked on the day of God's judgment. But whatever the case, the point here is that Jesus now stands alone. Everyone has left him. Jesus is then tried before religious leaders, and justice clearly isn't their goal here. The leaders are looking for every reason to have Jesus executed, but the witness testimonies are inconsistent and they're not going anywhere. So the high priest takes a different approach, asking Jesus if he is the Messiah, the King of Israel. This is a political maneuver, because if Jesus says yes, they could paint him as an enemy of Rome. And the high priest gets away with more than he bargained for. Jesus says yes, And then he says, they will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. The high priest hadn't been asking Jesus if he was divine, but Jesus offered up that information, claiming to be the divine judge. He is putting himself on the same level as God, and from the high priest's perspective, this is a better answer than he could have hoped for. Not only can they tell Rome that Jesus claims to be the Messiah, a rival king to Caesar, but now they can claim that he has committed blasphemy against God and feel justified about trying to get him killed. Mark then tells us about Peter, who is facing his own kind of trial. Having followed Jesus to where he had been taken, Peter is accused 3 times by people nearby of being associated with Jesus, and 3 times Peter denies it. Despite assuring Jesus that he would never do such a thing, Peter fails Jesus in this moment. This is a sad chapter. But as we behold Jesus, let us notice that at no point in this chapter does Jesus lose control. In verse 65, for example, while Jesus is being beaten and spit on, people mock him as a false prophet. And yet, the irony is that Jesus prophesied that he would be beaten, and he prophesied that Peter would deny him. All throughout Mark 14 are reminders that God's purposes are being carried out here. Jesus said, "One of you will betray me." He said his blood will be poured out for them. He said, "After I've risen, I will see you in Galilee." And he said, "You will see me coming on the clouds of heaven." Ultimately, Jesus is not the one on trial here. The religious leaders are. In his suffering, Jesus is in control, and he is in control in our sufferings as well. And just as his sufferings gave way to glory, our sufferings will too. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.